Hi, hello everybody. Welcome to our virtual credit and supplier risk event. My name is Benny Kesuma. I'm the APAC head of risk solution for Bureau van Dijk. Thank you all for joining us today at this panel discussion. And today we will explore the following theme. How has third-party risk management been affected by the global pandemic? The fact is, COVID-19 has led to more scrutiny and more dependence on the financial and supplier risk management. And in this session, we'll discuss where this has created stress points, where the potential legacies are, and including things like improved data governance and also efficiency. And some of the topics we'll cover today will be how the pandemic impact on the APAC economy, how has third-party risk management evolved as our ecosystem become more globalized, and what developments around data, automation, and technology that could be more relevant and in improving efficiency. So on your screen right now, you will see a couple of folks here. We have, well, depending how you see on your screen, but we have three main panelists here, quite an interesting eclectic bunch. The first one is Steve Cochrane. Steve is our APAC Chief Economist from Moody's Analytics. We have a second one, Kundhavi Ramachandran. She's the EY consulting partner joining us from Mumbai today. And third, we have Chris Holmes, who's the founder of Portt, based in Australia. So we have rather three diverse set of individuals, right, giving us their viewpoints on how they look at the third-party risk management. So perhaps before we start and we jump into the question, maybe let's get each of them to have a short, quick self-introduction. Maybe we'll start with Steve first. Steve, if you can.
All right, Benny, thanks so much. Yeah, I'm Steve Cochrane. I'm Chief Asia Pacific Economist for Moody's Analytics. I'm based in Singapore. I've been with Moody's Analytics for a long time, 28 years to be precise, and spent a lot of my career in the US doing macroeconomics, both nationally in the US and internationally, and came to Singapore about 2 years ago to manage our economic research work here in the Asia Pacific region.
All right. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for the introduction. Now, shall we go on to Kundhavi, please? Kundhavi, if you can.
Thanks, Benny. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kundhavi Ramachandran, partner with Ernst & Young, specializing on risk management and process consulting. I have about 16 years of experience advising various clients, including the Fortune 100 and Fortune 500 clients, large listed organizations, on how do you identify risk, what are the best practices, how do you manage the risk, and how do you mitigate the risks, and therefore, how do you evolve your processes, and how do you make the best use of technology around your risk management function. And it's my pleasure to be here today and meet with all of you. Quite excited.
Thanks, Kundhavi. Thanks for the introduction. Now, shall we have Chris from Down Under?
Thanks, Benny. G'day. My name's Chris Holmes, so I'm the co-founder and CEO of Portt. Portt is a procurement, sourcing, contract and supplier risk management software technology platform. So we're about 12 years as an organization who uses technology and consulting to enable large government, large private, to enable better outcomes and transparency through the sourcing process, the contract management process, and all the subsequent supply chain and supplier risk management process. So through our adventures, our journeys, we've worked with a very wide range of diverse organisations, from some of the mega government agencies across Australia and New Zealand, some of the ASX 100 listed companies, and across a wide series of industries. So we've had a diverse set of experience of looking at technology solving consistent problems across quite diverse industries, and getting really good insights as to what's common amongst industries and what's quite unique and different as to how these industries solve these problems. So very much hoping my insights can be useful today, and thank you for having me.
Thanks. As you can see, we have really an interesting crowd here, right? We have, in fact, it's represented by different parts in Asia Pacific, right? So I think today we should have quite a fun time listening to these guys, hearing their expert opinions. on some of the questions that we have, right? And let's get on with it, right? So the first question I have for you guys here is, the fact that regardless whether the vaccine is, well, they say the vaccine is 90% accurate, there's talking about this, but the fact is there's still no sustained abatement, right, of COVID. If you look around, cases are still increasing. It's not as if that they're going down in many parts of the world. And so how do you see the impact, right, on the business in specifically in Asia Pacific? And is there any country or is there any region you think in our region, or any countries there that perhaps is more negatively impacted as we go into 2021, right? I would reckon maybe Steve, it might be good to you have a chief economist, it might be good to hear if you can get the ball rolling, that'll be appreciated.
Be happy to, Benny. Let me, I'll just lay out what I'm seeing in the economy, and we can use this as a little bit of context for the rest of the discussion. You mentioned the vaccine, and it sounded like you mentioned that with a little bit of a question mark in your statement, which I think is correct. I think it's the way we have to think about this in terms of its impact on business and impact on the economy. The news is fantastic that Pfizer vaccine may actually have a 90% effectiveness rate. The thing we have to remember is that Pfizer themselves are saying, well, it's going to be the middle of next year before it's scaled up and there's production. There are some risks because I understand that this vaccine will require 2 shots, an initial inoculation and a booster, which will make it a little more difficult to effectively administer globally. So, so the true effectiveness, we just don't know yet until we know the processes are going to be used to administer it. But it's good news. And it brings to an important point out, indeed, a change in the way we're thinking about COVID-19 and its impact on the economy. For a long time, we, at least as economists, in trying to factor these risks into our forecast, have been thinking about it as a discrete event. There was a start date, January 2020, essentially, when it was first apparent in China. And then the assumption is there's an end date whenever there's a vaccine. And so first of all, we keep putting that end date out a little farther. It may be mid-year next year. And then again, the uncertainty about its administration means that we probably should stop thinking about it as a discrete event with a beginning and an end, but a process that will be with us for a long time. And this is something that everyone is going to have to manage in their own business processes and managing their own risks. So that's my first point. I think it's just sort of a high level. How should we be thinking about this? In taking it a little closer to home, to Asia, Asia is perhaps in the best position right now to manage COVID. Most of Asia has proved that they are both willing and able to manage not only the initial COVID pandemic, but also secondary infections that have occurred. And nearly every country has been able to manage that, and to a much better degree than Europe and North America. The whole global economy has already moved out of recession. The recession hit hard in the first quarter, second quarter, first half of this year. And now the real question is, what is the path of recovery, which we're in right now? It seems like the recovery is being driven by the goods producing sectors, by manufacturing. There's a lot of demand, pent-up demand for goods around the country initially, and a little bit narrow, but medical equipment, medical supplies, PPE equipment and stuff. And also technology equipment. The fact that we're meeting here on Zoom requires us all to have a laptop, and we need to have corporate systems in place that can manage Zoom. And that's a global phenomenon that who would have known a year ago, and driving a lot of demand for electronic equipment, computers, mobile phones, and so forth, both in the corporate world and in education, where so much education is being done online as well. So the global industrial production and global trade, of course, fell off very sharply early on in the pandemic, but it has come back, not back to where it was prior to the pandemic, but it has come back very quickly. And we can see the country that has really benefited from the most from that is China. There are a number of very, very good indicators about China being back on its feet. If you look at anything from industrial production to retail sales to fixed asset investment, they've all come back and are now above where they were a year ago. They've managed to get the manufacturing processes up and rolling very, very quickly and linked to demand all around the world. And not only have exports out of China, from China increased, but imports into China are rising now as well, and they're helping drive many of the other economies of the APAC region because of the supply chains throughout the region. If you look at the export data across the region, Vietnam, Singapore, Taiwan, Malaysia, Korea, they're all looking pretty good now in terms of exports. So we see that really beginning to build the economy. It's not uniform across the region, depends on the industrial structure of each country. Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia still struggling, even Japan struggling a little bit. Its high-tech industries are more closely related to the global auto industry as opposed to computers and other kinds of technology. That will come back, but it will be delayed. So again, I think we can think of Asia as being probably in the best position right now in terms of its recovery. Of course, there are risks. There are risks in terms of what happens in Europe and North America, with Europe in its second wave and North America in its third wave of COVID. My assumption is that the shutdowns will not be so great. And in fact, the manufacturers in particular, I think in many industries have learned to keep production open with social distancing in place and managing the safety of their staff, and also increasing automation and such. So that has helped. And then there are policy uncertainties in terms of whether governments are going to continue supporting industries that are very, very weak over the next year or so until the economy really comes back. And of course, there are issues in terms of policy related to credit. There are a lot of credit debt payment holidays out there all around the world that will have to come to an end at some point. And the hope is that they're not ended too soon before the economy is coming back fast enough to be able to support those industries that will have to start making payments again on the debt that have been withheld. So again, I think it's a largely positive message about Asia, but with these caveats that, of course, there are risks and it will be with us for a while, and we have to manage this as a process. I think that's enough from me, Benny.
Thanks, Steve. I think you mentioned a couple of interesting points, right? I mean, I go back to the last one that you mentioned about the debt payment holidays, and I think this is also echoed by the DBS CEO, Piyush, right? And he was saying that, well, if you think 2020 is bad, 2021 gonna be worse, because a lot of the debt holidays might not be there anymore, right? The government might not have enough funds to continue, right, supporting certain government. Well, Singapore, we see that they are still happening, but perhaps in other region that might not happen. So I think I can relate to that. And like what you said, I think certain industries will be perhaps more positively affected, and some will be more negatively affected, right? But that's what we see. And yeah, indeed, I think we see that a lot in the news for China going up, right?
Right.
And maybe
right.
one last point on just going back about Pfizer, right? I think you mentioned that they're using a two-shot process, right? I mean, it's quite cumbersome to take the vaccine, right? I'm just thinking a lot. Why can't they make it like the blue pill? You know, it works very well, right? Everybody is happy about that. Okay, all right. So I guess that certainly is an interesting viewpoint, and I think it's very valid from our economists. Might be good to see what Kundhavi would say. I mean, we know India is also struggling a bit to keeping under control. Well, it's a big country, right? It's not easy. What's your thoughts? I mean, on this, on in the region, at least in the South Asia region, do you think that there'll be a lot of negative impacts, at least for what you see? Because I know you deal with a lot of global MNC in your work.
Absolutely, Benny. I think one, to Steve's point, right? It's going to be different for different countries. But what we need to also think through is the fact that today world trade is a lot more globalized. So the impact on one, we've seen that play out, in the last few months, is that the impact on one country really has a reeling effect on so many other countries. Where to simply say, let's say in India, you had shortage of technological components because a bulk of them were getting imported from China, Korea, and Thailand. So you will continue to see struggles, but then you would also see that, and which is what we are seeing in India as well, is that the economy is bouncing back. And one important factor is the human resilience, which is to say, okay, I know the circumstance, given that's what it is, how do we get back to work? Because you have to keep the business going, you have to keep the families going. So how do you get back to work? And that sentiment, because it's already been 8 months, is what is probably going to help with the recovery. Another important point which Steve made is businesses have found how to run manufacturing plants with appropriate social distancing and precautions. Businesses have found how to protect their employees, either in terms of increased insurance or providing certain specific health facilities to help business keep running. Businesses have found how to use technology to be able to directly reach out to your customers without a lot of physical infrastructure in place. And how do you continue to keep business growing? So if you see, e-commerce has emerged as a very, very significant enabler, especially at least in India. We've seen the boom of e-commerce in the last few months, right from groceries to food, to apparel to retail. The way that it has spanned out is really, really tremendous, and that's a trend that we will continue to see in the few months, and that's a positive sign.
Thanks, Kundhavi. I think from what you say, I think, as you said, there's a human resilience involved, and water seems to find their own level, right? After a while, people adjust, right, in how they work. Whether it's a meter or two apart, it's social distancing. People sort of fall into that, right? So I think that makes things a little bit easier. Okay, thanks, Kundhavi. And Chris, I know you do a lot of business in Oceania and Australia and New Zealand, and that part has sort of get things under control. I think especially in New Zealand, right? This has been doing great. What's your thoughts? What's your thoughts on this business impact so far, at least in your region?
Yeah, look, I guess I can speak from both a regional standpoint and also being a business that operates in the region. So look, I guess firstly I'll start with the fact that Australia and New Zealand were probably two of the countries that got on top of it the fastest and most successfully. But they did have the huge advantage of being very tiny populations on islands where they could lock everything down quite quickly. And even in saying that, New Zealand did an exemplary job, and Australia had a few false starts, but ultimately right now it's essentially under control. So from a regional standpoint, I think Australia, the outlook for both countries is very, very healthy. Business is essentially back to usual in the industries that weren't heavily impacted. And I think the key takeaway is it's the industries, not so much the country, in terms of Australia and New Zealand. So Steve alluded to it, but we've seen a massive upswing in the amount of business done by technology companies. There's been this big drive towards digitization, virtual teams. No matter what industry you're in, you've essentially needed to pivot your business model to actually start being able to engage in a virtual capacity. So whether it be desktop modernization companies, organizations like Zoom and Microsoft through the uptake in things like Teams, tech's done really well. And I think that's been quite reflected too in the global stock exchange, with it probably being the asset to invest in right now. It's the one that most people feel most confident in. On a personal level, we had two of our biggest quarters ever in the middle of the pandemic, because as an organization that de-risks procurement, supply chain and sourcing, and that creates value within an organization, we were seen as a massive value-adding organization that were reducing FTE to be able to accommodate the impacts to their business from a COVID standpoint. But then flipping it, you look at other sort of regional businesses. Tourism within Asia Pacific is probably one of the industries that's been most heavily impacted. And directly in conjunction to that is obviously the airlines. So anyone operating in aeronautics, the amount of tourism between Australia, New Zealand, China, India, etc., throughout the Southeast Asian region was immense. That's obviously died off almost completely, and you can sort of read and see from countries like Indonesia with Bali and all these other major tourist hubs around Southeast Asia, they're really starting to feel the pain. And I think they're industries that are going to continue to suffer for quite a long time because there's really no end in sight for a lot of countries opening their borders. At least I know Australia and New Zealand will probably maintain quite tight travel bubbles, and they'll probably open up to countries like Singapore, maybe Japan, but they're going to need some demonstrable evidence that these other countries have got pandemic under control. So I think that's going to have an ongoing impact on these countries that are really reliant on tourism as a primary form of industry. I think the upside is, if you look at the region, Asia Pacific, if you were to draw a line from India down to Australia and up to sort of China and Japan, you're probably looking at, and I'm not going to do the maths, so no one please fact check me here, but probably 2/3 of the population on the planet within that region. So I think the sheer impetus that's going to come from the bloc, the region sort of operating and trying to get back to business as usual is really going to drive opportunity. It's going to drive a lot of re-engagement. We'll probably end up covering things like supply chain diversification through our chat today, but even if supply chain diversification is happening, it's happening within the region. If Australia is looking to start alternating sourcing from China to countries like India and Vietnam, it's all within the region, right? So the region as a collective is going to benefit. So I think ultimately everyone within the Asia Pacific region is really well placed to get on top of it. I think there's obviously going to be concerns that Steve talked about on the second wave, the third wave, and maybe adopting to what we would consider the new norm. I think this is probably the way things are going to be for the future, and we need to adjust our business to accommodate it. But on the whole, I think Asia Pacific's really well placed to recover.
Thanks, Chris. I think being in Singapore, being here, I think it's good to hear that that APAC is I think as a region, right, is doing well and it's adjusting to the new norm. It seems quite in an efficient manner, right? And indeed, you're right. I think some of the tourist-related industry is going to be suffering for a bit more time, right? Personally, I hope there's going to be a travel bubble to Australia and to New Zealand. I think that would be nice for Singapore, but yeah. And I think like what you said, some industry, the tech apparently is doing very well. Well, congrats on your great 2 quarters.
Thank you.
All right. Just before we jump into the second question, I thought it might be nice to have a little poll, right? Just to hear from the audience what they think, right? So here's the first poll question for the audience. Do you think this pandemic brings an urgency to enhance supplier risk management, right? So let's see. We have 3 simple answers: yes, no, maybe. Right, let's wait a little bit. Right. All right, let's wait for a few more. We're checking. Here we got the answers. Okay, so most people think that something needs to be done, right? That there is an extra urgency to look at supplier risk management. Nobody says no, but there are a couple of skeptics out there, right? Who say, well, maybe, right? Either they could be already be doing it, or they think that, well, it's a new norm. Okay, interesting. And I think this brings us to the next question, right? The next question is, how does COVID-19 brings an urgency to supplier risk management, right? We've seen the poll earlier. Most people seem to say yes, some say no, but how does it, who should we start for this? Should we start with perhaps Kundhavi? Maybe it might be good to hear your thoughts.
In terms of, Benny, if I understand your question right, you're really asking if where should we start with supplier risk management, and who should we start and how should we approach? I would probably put it in 3 parts. What do you do now, which is immediate? What do you do for the mid to short term, and what you really need to do for the longer term? And I would say now, next and beyond, in terms of a framework. In terms of what you need to do now is both from a supplier and a customer perspective, it becomes very important. And that's why, I would prefer to use this term third parties to really see who are those critical third parties in your ecosystem. They could be suppliers, they could be your customers. The key is when you assess criticality, really look at not necessarily the ones with whom you have only large spends, but also, those third parties who are very critical to your ecosystem. For example, it could be a small part, a small value in terms of overall element, but those are suppliers. If those don't come in, your entire ecosystem gets into trouble. So who are those? So really about identifying those and managing them. When we say managing them, understand if they are in distress. Do you have any issues around continuity of supply? Do you have alternate suppliers identified and developed? Are you single sourced or dual sourced? Are you multi-sourced? So those are questions that you need to address on the immediate term. Prepare a strategy, continuously monitor and respond as it evolves. So this is more crisis management, right? The second phase of it is, how do you prepare for the mid to long term? Okay, this is where we are going to be, let's say in the next 8-10 months. How do we really augment our strategy? What else do we need to do? If we were to move around either our sourcing elements, or if we were to move around or build suppliers, or if we were to provide that stress relief to suppliers, what are those interventions going to be? How are we going to assess? How are we going to prepare? How are we going to sense and respond? So that's the second bucket. The larger theme is given you could have more shocks like this. How do you really look into your ecosystem with a completely different lens? Saying, if you were to, what's the risk appetite? So that would involve organizations and prospecting to really see what's your risk appetite, right? How risk averse or how risk tolerant you are, and therefore what's going to be your strategy across your entire ecosystem on third party suppliers. What sort of data and technology, you cannot manage it manually in a longer term. What sort of data is out there? What is it that you're going to integrate? What sort of technologies that you really need to augment your early warning signs, augment your strategy execution, augment your monitoring mechanisms and your response mechanisms? And then think through that and put all of that together in the place is really the beyond phase.
Okay, thanks, Kundhavi. I think you sort of break it up really into two main parts, right? The crisis management, which is really the immediate phase. And then, like what you say, is the medium and long term, right? What's the next step after so-called this crisis is over, right? So I think that is interesting. And Chris, what do you reckon from that viewpoint? I mean, is there any urgency, or how does that urgency create more enhanced supplier risk management?
So I think urgency is the key word here. So urgency sort of highlight whether your supplier risk management is practical or perceived. And what I mean by that is, prior to COVID, there's obviously been an increased focus on supplier risk management. Things like modern day slavery, sustainability, etc., have become a key component in things like an organization, big corporates, corporate social responsibility. So there's been a gradual shift to the concept of supplier risk management and understanding your supply chain becoming more and more important. But probably prior to COVID, a lot of that focus was on perception. So what is the reputational risk? Do we want to be seen to be responsible, etc. I think what COVID has highlighted through things like border lockdowns and freight transport, etc., being disrupted, is some but not all organizations out there have been generally disrupted, and they're, as to use Kundhavi's term, they're in crisis mode. So it's, okay, we need to figure out what our supply chain looks like. We need to source alternative supply chains, and we need to de-risk and diversify our supply chain for us to be able to operate as a business. And it's that operation versus perception. So that what it's done is, I think it's created a bit of a fire under some organizations where there is an imperative now to diversify your supply chain, which means the supply risk management becomes a very real thing. Like, some of these organizations are very much in survival mode now. If we cannot diversify our supply chain, we're no longer able to manufacture the products or the services that we provide, which means essentially we're going to lose revenue or potentially even go out of business. So that becomes a big deal. The other thing that it's created some urgency around is more from the sell side, not the buy side. So obviously buy side's getting very, very focused on understanding supply chain, de-risking the supply chain. sort of flipping it, there's now an ever increasing expectation on sell side. And, you know, I say this as even as a tech provider, you know, we're asked to demonstrate this kind of evidence quite frequently, where as a member of your supply chain, I now need to prove to you that I have de-risked my own supply chain for you to feel comfortable doing business with me. Otherwise, given the sensitivity and the global situation with the pandemic, you will probably disengage me and find a supplier that you perceive as safer. So it's very much risk management is now urgent up and down the chain. And there's the urgency in that I need to maintain my own supply chain, but there's also the urgency that myself as a provider and a seller need to demonstrate up the line that I've got my supply chain under wraps, because there's a good chance I will no longer be able to do business if I can't prove that. And we, as I said, even as a tech provider who, to be honest, our strategic supply chain is one supplier, and that's Microsoft, you know, who I like to think is a relatively safe bet from a global standpoint. But even then, you know, when we're doing business with our customers, like we as a small business are basically providing War and Peace on our supply chain. What are the risks? What are the impacts? And I would say our risk profile is probably the lowest you could possibly get as an organization in any industry. But this is still a big deal for our customers. Now, if you think about that and compound that out to, you know, multi-stage manufacturing processes, the resources sector, et cetera, the amount of transparency that people are now going to need to demonstrate all the way up and down the chain for people to feel comfortable that the risk is being managed is getting quite immense. So I think that the risk is also not just the supply chain risk management piece, but also the risk of not managing your supply chain will have quite a material impact on different industries now.
Chris, I'm just going to ask one question on what you said earlier. You talked about de-risk, right? And transparency. How easy it is from what you have seen so far, because it's, as we said, the world is connected. Your supply chain could be apart from India, apart from China, apart from Singapore, and, you know, or Malaysia. How easy is it to actually, in a practical manner, talking about de-risk?
I think it's on an industry by industry basis. And that's just not the industry you play in, but also the size of the organization. There's a lot of, like, big pharma is a really good example. Like pharmaceutical organizations, it's an industry that has been very, very sensitive around supply chain and perception. You know, reputational risk and reputational value is something that they place quite highly. And as a result, a lot of the big pharmaceutical companies around the world have had, way before COVID, like massive teams who focus just on supply chain analysis. And if they don't have that internally, then they're investing a sizable amount of money engaging these large multinational consulting companies who do nothing but supply chain analysis. And that'll be down to, you know, consultants going out, inspecting mines, you know, in African countries, just to make sure that they're all being compliant with what's expected from a supply chain perspective. So I think, you know, large multinationals, it's probably not going to be too hard, because you've already invested in the resources to do it. And if you haven't, you've got the ability and the money to tap into those resources. I think where it's going to get really challenging is in the small and medium enterprises all across Asia Pacific, where this has traditionally not been an ask, or if it has, it's always been quite light touch, and now it's becoming quite a big deal. They typically do not have access to the resources you would need to de-risk a supply chain. They don't potentially have the revenue streams to de-risk the supply chain. And for them to be able to get it at a global level, so as I said, if I'm selling computer parts in Indonesia, the reality is it's probably 8 levels of supply chain potentially beneath me, but I'm not going to be able to map that out. I think a really big challenge is going to be in the SMEs not having the resources and capabilities to actually go and do that in-depth supply chain analysis. And I think as there's more and more drive for large corporates to compel these SME providers to provide this information, it's going to create a lot of tension and, you know, a lot of risk as well for these small providers, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to provide this evidence to be able to do the business that you want to do. So I actually think it's quite a complex exercise, depending on how big an organization you are and ultimately how complex your supply chain is, which I know isn't a very direct answer. But yeah, it varies, I suppose, is my response.
Yep, appreciate that. I think I could say that size matters, right? The bigger the company, it seems like it's easier to get resources to do things, but the fact that the company is large and all over, there's a complexity behind it, right? I think it works both ways, right?
Sure.
And okay, thanks. So I'm just going to turn this to Steve, because we saw from Kundhavi, from Chris, what they talk about is process planning and all that. But from an economist perspective, Steve, what do you think? Because, you know, an example, I'm trying to buy bikes, and they say the Shimano gears, which is the world premier supplier of gears, they're out of stock, right? And that means here you have a ready customer, but I can't get my stuff, right? So what you reckon from a macroeconomic perspective?
Yeah, my local bike shop tells me it's the 3-month wait minimum for a new bike, so I've given up. I've got my old 25-year clunker I still ride out there. So when I think about this from my viewpoint as an economist, I must say I think about it a little bit kind of over the long-term point of view, as Kundhavi was talking about, how are the different time frames to think about this. In that, you know, there are many ways of measuring risk, many factors that one has to take into account to get a full view of overall supply chain risk. So, you know, there is things we've been looking at for a long time: geopolitical risk, and the US-China trade war brought that to the fore. Labor market risk, whether labor is going to be available, whether it's going to be priced appropriately, or whether there are issues of slavery and such, which then goes to the ESG factors, the environmental, the governance, social factors, including climate risk. And here in Asia, of course, there are lots of issues of climate risk, particularly related to weather and typhoons and such, and how that can disrupt the economy and manufacturing, at least in for a short period of time. And now we have this issue of trying to manage what I think you can honestly say is a tail event, or a completely unexpected event, and at least for most of us. And COVID is one of those, and who knows what that next tail event will be. And so with that, what we've been able to learn anyway through COVID is it's kind of a real-time laboratory of who can manage tail events effectively, respond quickly with the policies that are required, and get through the event and get the economy back on its feet. And we can see that Korea, Taiwan, China, to a certain extent, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, certainly, you know, are countries that have shown that they have been able to respond very quickly and very appropriately to managing the COVID. So that may very well add a new dimension to long-term planning for location of elements of supply chain. I think Chris's comment about the importance of SMEs and the ability to keep SMEs operating, because they are kind of the hidden component of supply chains, right? And this also is where we can see some policymakers are being a little more effective in terms of being laser focused on supporting SMEs or labor that have lost their jobs, keeping them alive, fed, keeping families fed, so they're ready to go back to work as soon as they possibly can. Some countries, I think actually use Singapore as an example, have been very effective in directing funding, fiscal policy support towards either SMEs or towards the industries that clearly were affected by COVID, so transportation, the airlines, hotels, and such that have been hit very hard, restaurants. And also trying to look to the future and providing the fiscal support to industries that likely may lead going forward. And this may be some of the tech-based industries, the supply chain, the IT, communication industries that will become increasingly important in managing supply chains. So I think we're kind of living in a real-time laboratory and in trying to see how well policymakers can respond to a tail event. And I think we'll see that factored into risk management practice going forward.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned, right, the so-called hidden component of the supply chain, right, which is the SME, right? They do supply quite a fair bit to some of the big MNC, but I think for them, there's always the issue of liquidity, right? How much money they can, because sometimes they depend month on month, and if that business stops for a couple of months, it's going to affect their cash flow, and that's their business could be viable, right? But the cash flow is going to be the tough one.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are the companies that may not have a line of credit anywhere, and can't go anywhere except family or friends for or investors that they know for support. They can't just walk into the bank and get a loan and walk out, same day.
Yeah.
It's just a different situation altogether.
Yeah, that's true. Make us feel like, we need to support the local store around the block, right? And more local. Okay, all right. So let us move on to the next question. But perhaps before we just move on to the next question, I have a second poll question, right, which leads up to the next question. And the second poll question is: do you think enhancing your third-party due diligence process will result in better data governance? And the first one is absolutely. Second one is, well, I think data governance is more of an I thing. And the third one is no. These are two separate topics. It shouldn't be lumped together. Let's see what the audience say. Okay. All right, we have the answers. Okay, first one say absolutely. Okay. Second one is, yeah, data governance is an IT thing. Yeah, could be, because well, the fact is data governance is a big topic, right? It's a big theme, right, on what you consider data governance. And most people think that these two are linked, or in fact, everybody thinks that these two are linked. So this leads up to my third question, about data governance. And in this pandemic, does it bring changes in data governance? And the fact that we are doing globalization, I mean, the business is globalized. How does it play in terms of data governance, right? Open to see if anybody would like to start on this.
Benny, I can go on this. My view is slightly different, right? I believe that, and having worked with clients and seen that, is if you have better data governance, that lends itself to better third-party due diligence and not necessarily the other way around. And I will give with examples. Let's come to the brass tacks of how supplier risk management is done by organizations. You say, okay, I have X supplier. The first question is, okay, how do I contact the supplier? Where have I stored the supplier contact details? Have the contact and the supplier moved on to another organization? How do I know? So in times of distress, when you have to urgently reach to a supplier, what really matters is what sort of data policies that you have, what sort of data governance that you have, how quickly and how regularly updated these are. And then you augment this with supplier due diligence data. So what have organizations not been doing for last few years, or what has been taken for granted, right? Is that the supplier will continue to supply as long as he's given me the same quality of material at the same price. These are the only two things which mattered. And it was literally taken for granted that supplier will have business continuity. What came into the fore because of this pandemic is that no, supplier may not have business continuity. Supplier could be in distress. Supplier's ability to handle distress for a prolonged period is what could cause disruption in your organization. And therefore, if you were to simply augment the data, have a governance model, and then overlay on top of that what you've learned during this pandemic, which is a great opportunity, and then say, okay, what additional information do I need to manage? What additional data about the supplier do I need to manage? How does that feed on into my risk monitoring and management mechanisms? And how do I integrate the technology? That's the way to go about it.
Thanks, Kundhavi. It's interesting, right? Data governance leads to better risk management, and not the other way, right? We often say that, well, let's sort out what we need to do on a day-to-day basis. Know your suppliers, know your third party, and then it will automatically result. But I think it's a very interesting concept, and I think you're right. Right? It's the other way around, right? Chris, what's your thoughts? I mean, you have software and process that's going on.
So I think starting with the absolute basics, you cannot manage what you cannot see. So if you do not have good data governance, you do not know who you need to be managing and in what capacity you need to be manage them. So I think, reinforcing Kundhavi's point, like even starting with basic data governance puts you in a much better position to actually start on a proper supplier risk management journey. And that is only enhanced by supplier due diligence. So I think what we've observed is data governance has become more important, and that's been driven by, I think, how shocked a lot of organizations were when COVID started kicking in and supply chains were disrupted, and they realized how poor the insights they actually had on those supply chains were. You'd have instances where very large multi-billion-dollar organizations were still managing most of their supplier lists and their contract registers, etc., through Excel spreadsheets. So their ability to actually go and make an informed decision and de-risk their supply chain in a quick fashion was non-existent because they just didn't have the data to support it, which obviously triggers a rapid rush around to try and fix those things. And, they've now got some better processes and procedures in place. And, these are all the reasons why we've had such a great 2 quarters. But there's been this really strong understanding that, with this event, this not maybe once in a lifetime, but hopefully once in a lifetime event that has really shone the spotlight on how poorly you actually understand your supply chain. And I do think most organizations, small and large, have actually been caught out to some degree. So if you don't have a good data governance structure, you're already in a terrible position. So, that is not just a case of who are your suppliers, but how are you contracted? What do their suppliers look like? One of the anecdotes we saw very quickly, and this was a lot of organizations rushing through all their contracts, trying to find active God clauses, force majeure clauses, so they could start disconnecting legally, from a contractual basis with suppliers that were now too risky. And then, where are these contracts? They sit in filing cabinets or Excel spreadsheets. So, this automatically became an expensive exercise where they were spending months trying to find copies of contracts to scan, to go through, pull out key clauses before they could even start addressing their supply chain problem with COVID. So, on the back foot for probably the first 3 months. Supplier due diligence is a massive improvement and uplift in that space. So once you know who your suppliers are, there's this concept obviously of strategic segmentation of suppliers and the necessity to apply due diligence to that. I think one of the key data governance pieces you'll probably ever get is that strategic understanding of suppliers. Because one of the challenges I think in the supplier risk management space is not so much the data, but also the capacity of an organization to manage that risk. And one of the only ways that you can allocate your finite resources to be managing the right suppliers or the strategic suppliers is by having the appropriate data to enable those decisions. So, this concept of strategic segmentation became really, really important for a lot of our clients who are our top tier suppliers, which suppliers do represent. Sorry, you're on mute, Benny. Were you talking? Oh, sorry, I'll keep going. So this became a really big driver. And then obviously, the benefits of using data aggregators to complement that. So back to my previous question observation around resourcing. If you don't have the capacity internally, then at least being able to tap into data aggregation services such as Bureau van Dijk became an automatic complement to that. So, we at least know who our strategic suppliers are now. We probably don't have the time to catch up and map out a full data governance structure, but we know that other organizations do have that. So, it's become a really big imperative for a lot of organizations now.
Thanks, Chris. I think you said it right. I think data governance, if that is the main objective, and I think there's a lot of benefits, right? There's a lot of benefits once you get your data governance process right, the policy, and as you said, enhancing it with third-party information to supplement whatever internal data that you already have on your third party. Okay. Perfect. Thanks, Chris. All right. Anything you reckon, Steve, on your end for this part?
Hey, Benny, I'm not quite sure I can add much more except to repeat this importance of data governance. I look at it from a whole different perspective, really, in terms of my work as an economist. And we live and die on data, right? The data that goes into our models. And if you can't trust the data that's going into the models, then how do you trust the results of the models and the forecast? Garbage in, garbage out, the old line. So, I mean, we've known for decades the importance of data governance for our work, and I can only echo what Chris and Kundhavi have said in terms of the huge importance of data governance, so that what you have, the information that you have, is meaningful and actionable.
Thanks, Steve. And I'm just gonna extend on that question, or rather on the answers that I think Chris and Steve are talking about on data, external data, right? And we know that data analytics, data can help a part in information, in smarter decision making. And in your view, because you all have done, being managed services and software, you have dealt with lots of external data. What sort of data that you think is essential, and how companies has evolved to utilize some of this information? Anybody would like to start on this? Perhaps.
Look, I'm happy to lead off. Yeah. So look, as I said, one of the biggest drivers we've sort of seen from this is an understanding of what's strategic and what do we need to be managing. Now, depending on what geographic you move between, how you define strategic can vary a little bit, but ultimately it'll come down to a few key aspects, being risk, spend, and the percentage they represent of a particular category within your business. So they're probably one of the three main data points that organizations have been trying to understand. So as I said, that's sort of the spend, the risk, and what percentage they represent of your category. In terms of the data, we've seen primarily driving this. So look, let's make the assumption most organizations, do not have great structures around capturing their full category spend, etc. All large organizations will usually have an ERP system, so a finance system, SAP, Oracle, Workday, doesn't matter what it is. And that will typically be, or traditionally has been, one of the first go-to areas that these organizations have relied on, especially in the absence of sort of well-structured sourcing, contract, supply management systems, or third-party sort of supplier due diligence and data systems, where they'll be going in, they'll be looking at spend. So as I said, this key objective of let's understand who our strategic suppliers are, is let's go and look at spend number one. So if we don't have an analytics dashboard, they can just tell us our top 10 suppliers straight away. We have to go and analyze spend. Who are we spending with? Who are our big POs? What categories do they sit across? What percentage of categories do they represent? Over what periods, etc. Are we looking at that? And they'll be using that data to actually map out sort of a strategic segmentation allocation, and then they can start doing sort of supplier risk management around that. So that internal spend has been a very good input to fill a lot of gaps that otherwise exist in the organization. Outside of that, other key elements will be supply chain data where it's available. Obviously not as available as a lot of organizations would like. I would say that the ability to readily tap into a good understanding of probably anything outside of your tier 2 suppliers. I think the stat is about 50% of organizations have got a good understanding on their tier 1 suppliers, and less than 10% of organizations globally could even probably state who their tier 2 suppliers are. So that's another big bit of data. If we're talking about COVID specifically, that's been needed and consumed from a decision-making perspective. Look, I would actually probably say they're the two biggest ones. So who's strategic, and then what does actual supply chain look like?
Thanks, Chris. I think you put in a lot of the internal data aspect, right? The first thing is to get the book in order, right? Internally, do you actually know what you have already collected, right? I think that's really a key thing. And Kundhavi, I know you deal with a lot of the MNC, like I said. What sort of challenges do they face? I mean, or what sort of things that you reckon will help them?
I don't think, if you were to look at large organizations, the entire approach to data governance, right? It's still very nascent and evolving from a maturity model point of view. The very few organizations who can truly claim to have, have more mature models, most organizations are, somewhere between basic and just moving to evolving or advanced sort of a concept. That's one. It's about having to add to what Chris said. It's about really, putting that in three buckets, right? One, who do you need to manage? Two, what do you need to manage? And three, how do you need to manage, right? It's very simple. When you look at who do you need to manage, what is the data that you need? Spend. Who are the people, the contacts, right? And do they continue to be relevant for you? And what part of supply chain do they cater for you? Very simple. When you come to what you need to manage, you essentially need to manage continuity, you need to manage compliance, you need to manage contracts. These are literally the three C's. And when you go to how do you manage, that's where you have to integrate the internal data that you have with the external data that you have, and then say what sort of approach that you're going to take. So it's pretty simple in terms of what you need to do. But the fact is, it's been a long ignored point of view, when especially when things are going very well. These are things that people tend to ignore, and that's where data governance really has come to the forefront right now, to say how can really data governance augment your third party risk management, and therefore how do you enhance the models and how do you build in technology. That's where we see organizations moving on right now.
Thanks, Kundhavi. I like how you simplify it, right? What, how, right? And I think it makes sense, right? Who do you need to manage? What you need to manage, and how do you do it, right? I think if we get that right, world is a better place. Okay, all right. Now, I'm aware of the time, so we have a couple of questions that came in. Now, before I jump into the Q&A session, maybe it's good to just have one final or perhaps two final questions just for the audience, just to see how they feel about the panel, right? Let's see. Okay, so here you go to see how whether you find the panel discussion and information useful or relevant. And the next one is whether would you like a meeting to understand how data and technology can help you in credit and supplier risk management. Let's see what's the answers. So host and panelists cannot vote. I like to vote. All right. Okay. All right. Now, let us go into the questions. So we have a few that came in. Let me see the first one. Okay, the first one that came in a while ago is, could you please let us know what's the most urgent issue in supplier risk management from this pandemic? Anybody would like to answer that?
Maybe I can go. I would say in one point, continuity. Right,
Continuity.
that's the catchphrase, and that's the most critical one. And that could mean, how would you ensure from a geopolitical perspective continuity? How do you ensure suppliers parts, right? So how do you look at the next layer for the supplier to say, how do you ensure continuity? And then the third element being financial continuity to the supplier as well. And that defines your policies and practices. Yeah, so I would say continuity.
Okay, thanks, Kundhavi. I hope that answers. I wonder if anybody else would like to add on to this.
Look, I think it's the perfect answer. Like, continuity represents a business being able to function and trade solvently. Like, at the end of the day, with that continuity, what have you got? I think that's perfect summation. Okay, thanks.
All right, we have another question that comes in here. It's on modern slavery, right? They say it seems that here is directed to Chris. Oh, must be from Australia. Question to Chris: how has Modern Slavery Act affected companies in Australia to manage risk in suppliers?
Back to a previous point, there's sort of there's the practical aspects of modern day slavery, and then there's the perceived aspects of modern day slavery. So look, I think any organisation, any business in Australia that's dealing with legislated organisations like government or large corporate that have strong CSR approaches have been impacted by modern day slavery. Prior to COVID, that's very much been around the perceived nature of modern day slavery. So, myself as a large entity, large corporate or government agency, I need to know what your approach is to managing modern day slavery. And without being facetious, sorry, a lot of that has been a box ticking exercise. So if you're bound by the Modern Day Slavery Act, you do need to report on certain things, but outside of that, it's really just let me know that you're doing the right thing. I think what's come about from COVID is because supply chain more broadly has become a bigger imperative. People are taking sustainability and modern day slavery quite a bit more seriously now, in that they're actually investing time in understanding supply chain. So there's been an uplift in both people doing modern day slavery exercises and businesses needing to report on modern day slavery exercises. To use really good examples, the fashion industry is one that's heavily impacted, where a lot of the time small fashion industry providers don't have good understanding of their modern day slavery, their supply chain. And as soon as there's even a hint that they're sourcing resources from a country that is not being compliant with, say, child trafficking or child labor laws, then that'll go out in social media and they're destroyed. So there's that perception angle. And then at a practical angle too, I think because COVID has driven this further drive to understand and investigate the concept of supply chain and supplier risk management, organizations are looking at themselves in a bit more detail, and they're probably discovering that some of the biggest risks they've got in the modern day slavery space is right at home. Your cleaning contract, your security contract, and I only sort of speak for the Australian New Zealand region, there's a very good chance that the organization you're engaging could be in breach of modern day slavery laws, illegal immigrants being compelled to work, visas and then passports removed, etc. I think it's really shining the spotlight that, and it's not a problem that exists in other countries. It's not a problem that exists in the developing world. It's a problem that exists everywhere, including in sort of nations like Australia and New Zealand. So it's being taken a lot more seriously.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I think it'll be good for companies to go beyond the checking a tick box kind of angle, right? I think there is a lot of benefits, right? I mean, being fair in terms of trade practices, in terms of your behavior, right? I think there's a lot of value in that. So, well, I hope that will lead to a much better thing, because I think right now MSA, I think it's only in UK and in Australia. Okay. Now one more question from here. How has other company done supplier risk management, and what's the best practice? What challenges have they faced in their journey? I kind of think this is a bit like what we talked about earlier about the new norm. What is considered new norm? I think both of you talked about the new norm, right? But here, I think people would like to know. I think, well, in the past is in the past, but it would be interesting to hear in the new norm, how would have they, what should they do, right, in terms of best practice for supplier risk management? Anybody would like to take that?
In terms of best practice for supplier risk management is effectively I think we spoke about that a little bit in terms of what do you need to do in the immediate term, hoping you've addressed that, what can you do in the midterm, and then really having your strategies and policies in place and supported by data and technology to really say, how do you prepare, how do you sense, how do you respond, right? That's really in sum and substance the key. As organizations navigate through this, I think what's important to know is what are the challenges that you will face. Number one challenge is going to be about data, right? What data that you have, to Steve's point, it's garbage in, garbage out. How reliable that data is, how are you going to augment that? What governance? You could do a one-time cleanup, but how are you going to maintain this in a very sustainable manner? And therefore comes the question of data governance. What is it that you're going to do? Second is, if you were to look at from your strategy and execution perspective, and then really say, what technology do you really need to manage this? How much visibility you need, who needs that visibility, how are you going to integrate with your systems, what sort of measures, performance that you're going to track? That's really the second question, right? In terms of, the technology piece of it. And the third piece, which people increasingly realize, is competence. Do you really have an integrated competence within the organization to look at third-party risks very holistically? You have organizations hitherto doing this in piecemeal. So you've got legal looking at legal point of view. Let's say you have finance looking at anti-money laundering and things like that. You've got supply looking at, just quality, cost, and those elements, and nobody looking at continuity. So how are you going to, integrate all of this and bring a holistic perspective? And therefore, what competencies do you need and what organization structure that you need? That's the more fundamental and evolving question.
Yeah, I like the fact that it's about the resources that the company has, how competent they are in that different risk functions, right, or different areas that they need to perform, right? And you talk about cleaning up the data. Yes, we encounter companies who are looking at one-time data remediation, but that's one time, right? And a year later or 2 years later, well, the data is going to get stale, right? But then perhaps they have an immediate problem to solve, and so they do a one-time data remediation, but that doesn't solve the whole data governance and being more efficient and effective in the future. Okay, perfect, thanks.
Yeah, just quickly on that, Benny, I would say outside of being able to compile the data, the biggest challenge organizations will have is the resourcing to do something with the data. You know, a lot of the time right now, it's data for the sake of data, but if you don't know what you're going to do with it and you don't have the teams that will get in there and manage the data, to Kundhavi's point, it's a fruitless exercise, right? You achieve nothing. You know, when the auditor comes around 12 months later and asks, why did you pick these up? You can at least say, look, we at least did remediation of our data, and we can show you that. But, you know, you need to be acting on it. Like, it has to be an ongoing practice. It has to be a living thing in the organization.
Yeah, perfect. That makes sense, Chris. All right, we've got one last question for, I think this should be for Steve, before we close this panel. Well, Steve, so we have a new president, right? Biden. Do you see a friendlier, you know, US-China relationship? How does it impact APAC, you know, going forward in 2020 and beyond?
The way I see it, I actually don't think friendly is the right term. Frankly, I don't think that there will be a friendlier relationship between the US and China. There are still too many differences in terms of leveling the playing field, everybody playing by the same rules in terms of trade. I think it's important to understand that the Democrats are I'll say this bluntly, are no friends of China, as the Republicans have shown as well. They have labor unions that they want to protect. They want to keep their supporters employed and so forth. So, you know, there are interests in the US that the Democrats will be very strong on, just as the Republicans have. I think the difference will be in the approach, that a Biden administration will take a much more multilateral approach. Clearly, they will re-engage with the World Trade Organization, perhaps re-engage with the TTP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership as well, and actually, in a sense, could be a more formidable negotiator if they go into negotiations as a consortium with a bunch of partners or allies. But the negotiations will be smoother. The negotiations won't be carried out on Twitter. They will not be volatile. There will be, I think, a much more clear direction of what the Biden administration will want to get from trade policy and trade negotiations. In a sense, the Trump administration has handed the Biden administration a weapon, and that is the tariffs that are in place already. Now, I think we can guarantee that there will be no increase in tariffs. There won't be any broadening of tariffs, which there might have been in a second Trump administration. And ultimately, those tariffs may come down, but they may very well be used as bargaining chips in the negotiation process. So I think it'll be smoother. We will see less volatility. And I think less volatility is good for industry. It's good for investors, and will likely help to accelerate the pace of global trade. When we look at global trade, there's a significant shift downward in trade almost the minute that the trade war was initiated by the Trump administration. I think we'll see some of that ease off as those uncertainties disappear.
Thanks, Steve. I think you used the right word, right? The approach, right? The approach sets everything, right? It sets the tone. It sets what you want to get, and the fact that the weapon is there, right? The tariff, the standard is already there, right? There's already high tariff, right?
Right.
I can go down to give concession, or I can maintain it, right? So I think they have a bit of leverage. I think the states have a bit of leverage in this respect, yeah.
A little bit right now. That's right. Yeah. I think if we look, you know, if you want to just take a guess at where we'll be at the end of a Biden administration, tariffs will very likely be lower than they are today. Certainly, tariffs that have been applied to U.S. allies will probably disappear very quickly. And then the tariffs that have been placed on Chinese goods, it's going to be a slower process. But ultimately, I'm sure as there are some the negotiations lead to compromise, that those tariffs will begin to come down as well.
Yeah, compromises. I think that's what we need at some point. Okay. All right. Thanks, Steve. Okay. So thank you, everybody. I think we come to the end of our panel discussion. I think we overshot a little bit in terms of timing. Now, just, and I know I was told that some of you wanted a trial. So for those that want a trial, please go to our risk station and register over there. Right. And so today, thank you everybody again for joining us. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Kundhavi. Thank you, Chris, for being our panelists today. And I know we hope to see all of you again soon.